So, this morning we reflected on this moonlit path, what the middle space looks like. However, one of those images may speak to you. For me, the one that speaks to me is the moonlit path. That's what came to me in my own reflection, my own prayer. Somebody else shared with me in their congregation, they have an illustration from Luke 5, lower your nets. We've labeled on that, and that's the image that came to her and her sisters. So whatever image works for you, is meaning for you, that's what you want to carry from today, definitely. All right? Whatever captures that middle space, what it is, what it feels like. Then I reflected with you in the second session on what is the commitment we're called to as we make this journey. What are we called to as disciples? And we are called, now hear this when I offer you this paradox, we are called to make the journey by remaining. We are called to make the journey by remaining. Remaining in the sense of all that I tried to offer you in the second session this morning. From the context of John 15, what it means to abide, to stay, to hold on to, and what it means to remain in such a way that I become the remains of the charism, and that I witness the dying of the form of religious life that I have known, and in the interim, I carry the breath of that charism. And I keep breathing it in and breathing it out and integrating it with myself so that it will have a life beyond me when it is raised up in its new form. All right, so I walk the journey by remaining. I walk the journey by remaining. What I'd like to offer for this afternoon then, sisters, is that we have good companions on this journey. Good companions. We have one another, first and foremost. We have one another. But we have good companions on the journey, and they are the women I would like to look at with you this afternoon. Okay. I offer them to you as what I call icons of discipleship. This visual is Mary Southard, CSJ. Much of her beautiful art is sold through the Ministry of Arts, Sisters in LaGrange, Sisters of St. Joseph, right? Okay. And I'll tell you just this interesting story. I gave this talk, that's how I think I got here, in South Carolina. And is that right? In South Carolina, to the sisters who gather there once a year. And I put this up on the screen. Guess who's sitting in the audience? Oh, I thought I would just drop over dead. Because, I mean, she could have been offended. You know what I mean? You know what I'm saying? Plus, this isn't the whole thing. I cut it off to fit it. To make it landscape, or whatever it is. Yeah, landscape instead of portrait. I'm going to give you the whole thing, though, in the handout for prayer. But, I mean, she was the most gracious, lovely, so happy. Anyway, I have more of that story, but that's for another time. But she was just, could not have been more gracious. And I mean, basically was tampering with her work. Do you know what I'm saying? Anyway. All right, but I use these. So I'm going to look at these women with you this afternoon. Okay? First of all, we're going to look at Mary. Mary is the icon of listening. She is the icon of what it means to follow Jesus in essential discipleship. I'm going to try to bring all this together with Ron Rolheiser and whatever else we'll move through. Okay, so she is the model for discernment as we walk this journey. Elizabeth, okay. Mary, of course, is the maiden. I'll talk about each one of these. Elizabeth, the mother, right? The mother. She is the icon of what it means to serve. Because remember Ron Rolheiser, you know? The maiden is trying to get her life together. The mother is trying to figure out how to give her life away. and Anna, the widow in the temple, trying to figure out how to give her death away. She's the matriarch. She's the matriarch. Okay? She is the contemplative par excellence. We'll look at her briefly. All right? What these three women share is this phrase: nothing will be impossible for God. Please take that in and believe that it is true. As I say that, I do not in any way diminish the reality of diminishment. Okay? But from a faith perspective, nothing will be impossible for God. That is true of these three women. Okay? And hopefully it will be true for you and me as well. So I want to look at each of them. If it helps you to have this scripture, I will make reference to it, but I'm not going to, what I usually do is I move line through line when I'm taking a piece of scripture. I can't do that today, but I will be making reference to it, all right? So first of all, I want to look with you at Mary of Nazareth, okay? She is, in terms of this movement of women, the phases of discipleship, what it means for women, she is the blessed maiden. She is a model, I don't like that word, but you know what I mean, icon, image of what it means to discern how to get my life together. Although she is that quintessential maiden Mary, okay, she teaches us how to listen in the middle space, the middle space. Now again, if you don't buy that we're there, it's going to be hard for you to listen to the rest of them. Okay, but if you can say, this is where my congregation is, okay, then Mary can be very helpful to us in learning how to listen in this middle space, because Mary's listening is her ability to discern paradox. Paradox. Again, I turn to Father Ron Rolheiser, one of my go-to guys. And in the Holy Longing, he has a beautiful section toward the end of that text on the phrase, she pondered all these things in her heart. Here in the Annunciation story that I've given you, she pondered what this greeting meant. Okay. Now he makes a very clear distinction as to what pondering means. If I say to you, what does pondering mean? You might say it means thinking about. It means considering. It means ruminating. It means whatever. They are all head words. Head words. He says pondering in a biblical sense means this. When it says Mary pondered, it said she had the ability to carry polar opposites. Polar opposites. Now here's the kicker. And not have to have them resolved. She had the ability to carry polar opposites and not have to have them resolved. Not have to figure them out. Not have to have them make sense. Okay? Now you see my visual. Okay? Because she pondered that. Talk about the Annunciation now. A virgin could become a mother. Because she believed that God could become human. Now you got to get that for a Jewish girl. The God, I don't like this visual, the transcendent, most holy, most high, mountaintop God could become human. Because she was able to hold those polar opposites, he says, she stood at the foot of the cross. She could believe that death could become life. Okay, they're the polar opposites sisters were carrying. See? And guess who's in the middle? We are. You see my visual? We are. We're being asked to carry the polar opposites of death and life in the middle space. Okay? And we're going to feel the pull of that. And we're going to feel the cost of that. And we have to be able to ponder the paradoxes that come our way. Because paradox is the language of the polar opposites. Paradox does not make rational sense. It cannot be figured out. The truth of it can only be felt. And I feel it in the core of my being, whether it makes sense to my head or not. We learn this from Mary. Okay? So we ask ourselves, not only for ourselves, how does the congregation listen in this middle space and discern how to get its life together? What kind of listening is required of us? What kind of holding of polar opposites must we carry? Now, in her Annunciation, the text of which I've given you, you have, again, I hate this word. I don't hate the word, but I hate to use these words for spiritual things, but a paradigm of a lovely discernment process. Don't we love discernment processes? Okay? You can't get better than this text from Luke. And Mary's ability to discern, to listen, This is the Tanner Annunciation, right? You love it? Yeah, I love it. Okay. So, Mary spends the early part of this text listening, which is the first step in any good discernment process. I listen. What does she listen to? She listens to her own historical context. Luke's great at setting the historical context. You know? It was the 6th month. It was the angel, not only any old angel, it was Gabriel. It wasn't any old town in Galilee, it was Nazareth. See, there's a specificity in the Gospel of Luke that is, I just find so beautiful. All right, so she listens to the context of her life experience, just like we're trying to do. Remember the signs of the times? Way back, perfected caritatis? Okay. So we're trying to listen, as she did, to the signs of the times, okay? Obeying, remember, is about listening. I'm giving my ear to. She's listening to the voice of God's unconditional love. Sisters, I cannot emphasize how important that is. The angel says to Mary, in this text, hail favored one, okay? Or hail full of grace, which I prefer. Hail full of grace, the Lord is with you. Now, suppose Mary had said at the end of this, no thank you, I'm not interested. Do you think God would have said, whoop, whoop, no more full of grace for you. I'm taking my full of grace back. No, God doesn't operate that way. I remember I said to her, once God gives, God does not take back. Okay? So God is saying to each of us and to our congregation, you are full of grace. Believe that. You have the resources you need for whatever I want to accomplish in you. You are favored, and I, notice, am with you. I am with you. I need to keep hearing that, sisters. God's love is not contingent on how many schools we build, how many hospitals we staff. Okay, God's love is not a contingent love. God's love is an unconditional love. You can't say anything after you've said that. Okay? She listens to the voice of her feelings. That's why I wanted you to be attentive to. Notice what the text says. She was greatly troubled. Are we not, many of us, greatly troubled? Sure we are. We're troubled. We're afraid. We're all these things. We've got to be able to hear ourselves. I need to hear myself say, I'm troubled. You know, we have a chapter coming up in 2020. I'm already ranting and raving. You know, so we're greatly troubled. We're afraid or whatever is going on in us. We have to listen to ourselves. And sisters, you can have some certainty that if you're troubled, so is your sister. It may exhibit itself in another way, but believe me, okay? So I need to listen to my feelings. I need to listen to the feelings of my sisters. Even if I can't relate to them, I need to hear them. They need to be received with respect and reverence. Okay? And we need to listen to the bottom line invitation of God. You will conceive. You will bear the incarnation. You will make the word become flesh. What's that Isaiah passage? I send out my word. It doesn't come back to me void. It does what I sent it out for. All right? So I need to believe that in the dark mystery of my own self, of that womb, God is at work being conceived. Incarnation is happening. Incarnation is happening. I need to keep listening. Listening. Then, as Mary does, I need to discern. This is the place of pondering. This is the place. What does the word discern mean? Sometimes we think it means to decide. It does not. Many years ago, when I was in leadership, you know, we have a sister come, let's say. I know this doesn't happen in anybody's congregation here, but in my congregation, Claire, I'm discerning, I'm leaving so-and-so and I'm going here. And I'm like, oh, you're done discerning. You've decided. See, and you're just telling me about it. Do you see what I'm saying? I'm being facetious. But discernment is not. Discernment is prior to the decision. Discernment is sorting out. Discernment is sorting out all that I've heard. And in all that hearing, to go deep enough to hear the voice of God that's in there. That's what discernment is. That's Mary's pondering. Now, when I'm in that process, there are times when I'm going to ask myself, like, God is calling me to what? Okay. And I say to myself, how can this be? I'm sure you've been to that place somewhere where you say, how can this be happening? How can the mother house be leveled? How can we have no vocations? How can this be? And we need to hear God say back to us, the power of the Most High will overshadow you. Now hear that word, overshadow. Okay? Not only the Spirit will overshadow, but you will be walking around in a shadowed place. A place of darkness, a place of moonlight, a place of mystery. And in the course of it, you will be shadowed over. That's a powerful word. It's a powerful word. Okay? So I need to be willing to walk in the shadowed place, because that is the place that's going to bring me to light. I hope you can hear these paradoxes. It is. If I walk in that mystery, I will come to the light. I will come to the light. Finally, then, Mary makes a response. See, we all like to jump to Mary's fiat, don't we? Oh, goody, goody. Let it be done. Okay? Let it be done. Now, this is captured in one, how many verses here? Whatever it is. 10, 12 verses. You think it took 3 minutes? Like when I read this, of course not. We have no idea how long it took for Mary to come to this yes. We don't have any idea. But she came to it. Let it be done to me. Notice she is not the doer of the action. That's a nice little passive voice. Right? Let it be done. Let it be done to me. All right? So Mary's, her Annunciation, that young maiden, huh? Right? Maiden Mary. We used to sing, oh God, when I was a novice, a beautiful old English lyric called I Sing of a Maiden That Is Matchless. Beautiful, beautiful. So Maiden Mary, okay, she's alive and well, and we need her as we walk this time in the life of our congregation. Okay. Now, the questions that are up on here, you have on your paper. I encourage you, if you find this meaningful, to share with your own sisters. Have conversation around these scripture passages. Have conversation around these questions. Reflect again on your own vocational call. call up that full of graceness moment. It is still there. It is still there. And it still wants to energize each of us. Okay. And then look at it in terms of your congregation as well. All right, but you have all those. I'm not going to linger here because you have those right in the handout I gave you. Okay? So, Elizabeth, blessed mother. Right? She is in that generative phase that Ron Molheiser talked about. Okay? She is in the fullness phase of the movement. All right? After all those years of barrenness. Now hear that. See? Hear Elizabeth. All those years of barrenness, all those years of waiting, finally, new life comes from her. Okay, but she had to be willing to feel her barrenness, to feel her emptiness, and in some measure to be scorned by the culture in which she found herself, because she was barren. And barrenness in this time was thought to be a punishment for sin. That either she had sinned or Zachariah had sinned or their father or mother or somebody had sinned, and that's why she was childless. All right? So, again, I've heard this, and we are where we are, because we haven't been faithful, or we are where we are because some of us gave up the habit, or we are where we are, we don't have vocations because X, Y, or Z. Sisters, don't do that. Don't do that. We are where we are because we've been faithful to what the church asked of us. We've made mistakes. Maybe your congregation hasn't. We sure have. We've made mistakes, but we're not where we are because we have not been faithful. Okay, we are where we are because we have been faithful to what the church asked of us. All right, so I've given you some of the excerpts about Elizabeth from the Gospel of Luke. I haven't given you the text of the visitation. I feel you know that story very well. And for our closing prayer, I'm going to invite us to sing the Magnificat. Okay, so you know that. But I've given you some other texts that I want to highlight. First of all, the name Elizabeth means God is enough for me. We better all take that name on. I met a Mary Elizabeth. Where is she? Yes, Mary Elizabeth. Okay. God is enough for me. There's a line in St. Francis's Praises to God where he says, "You are enough for us." We got to ask ourselves, is God enough for us right now? Okay. So she is a good companion for us. What is the task of mature discipleship? To be generative. We're discerning how to serve in the middle space, how to give birth in what feels like an empty time, a time of diminishment. Okay? This was true, of course, for Elizabeth. All right, she's struggling how to give her life away, and yet she feels that barrenness, she feels that emptiness. But because she believed, remember the phrase, nothing is impossible for God. Because she was faithful, she gave birth to her husband, Zachariah. Oh, I should say this first. Excuse me, I'm getting ahead of myself. So we need to ask, given where we are, given our aging, given our diminished numbers, Elizabeth invites us to ask the question, how am I, my congregation, how are we being called to serve at this time? How are we to give our life away? For some of us, I know, are setting up like foundations. Setting aside some of our assets to be then, after we're gone, or whatever the future looks like for us, that our good works in some way can continue, because we're setting aside what we have as assets now. We're giving, like the widow's one, not from our surplus, but from our want. All right? Many congregations that I've been with are doing those kind of things. So for many of us now, our serving is not hands-on serving. That, you know what I mean, being in a classroom, being, you know, working at a nurse's station. It isn't that anymore. So how are we being invited to continue to be of service at this time, right? How can we, as Elizabeth offers us, how can we continue to generate life? How can we carry others in what I like to call the womb of compassion? Several years ago, you know, Pope Francis declared the year of mercy, right? The year of mercy. Do I have mercy sisters here? I better be careful.
No, they have a meeting.
Oh, they have a meeting, good. No, not good, but I mean, talk about barking at the choir. But anyway, in his document that declared the year of mercy, called Misericordiae Vultus in Latin, which means the face of mercy, he begins that document by saying Jesus Christ is the face of God's mercy. Bingo. That's the whole thing. Jesus Christ's face. But he does a beautiful exposition on the biblical meaning of mercy. And he says in that document that in Hebrew, the Hebrew root word is the same for mercy and womb, W-O-M-B. Both of those words in Hebrew come from the same root, mercy and womb, W-O-M-B. And then he develops a beautiful reflection on the mercy of God that has nothing to do with pity, but has everything to do with God's unconditional love. See, that will carry each of us in the womb of God's self, God's mother self, until we are born into the image and likeness of the Christ that we're meant to be. That God's going to carry us that way unconditionally, full of grace. See, full of grace. So Elizabeth very much holds this. This, by the way, is a watercolor of a scene in the Nativity. The film The Nativity, have you ever seen that? Oh, it's a beautiful film. Oh, it's so real, so lovely. And Mary and Elizabeth are wonderful in that film. But anyway, because Elizabeth believed, you know, she was able also to hold polar opposites, that a barren one can give birth. A barren one can give birth. She gave birth to Zachariah, who was equally denigrated because they were childless. Of course, Elizabeth gets blamed, as you'll see in the text. They were childless because she was barren. Whatever. Anyway, so she gives birth to Zachariah. Why? Because his mouth is opened, right? His mouth is finally opened. He was silenced, as you will remember, okay? And she gives him descendants, which for a Jewish couple, that was everything. That was everything. Because without descendants, you might as well just be dead while you're living, okay? She gives birth to Mary, of course, in her receptivity to Mary, in her ability to have compassion for Mary, to carry Mary, to be there for Mary in Mary's need. Okay? She gives birth, of course, to John, okay? The last great prophet, precursor of the Lord. Okay? And finally, she gives birth to herself by giving birth to this child. So again, for us, what are we being invited to now in terms of what we're called to carry? What kind of birthing is God asking of us? And do we believe that from this time of diminishment, fullness can be born? And that we are the carriers of it. That's what it means when I said earlier, we are the remnant, we are the remains. You think of, what do you call that? We're in a holding pattern on an airplane. We hate that. I hate it. All I want to do is land. See? But this is where we are. We're in this holding pattern. And this is what God's asking of us. We're invited to remain in this holding. And sometimes it feels like we're going around in circles. Sometimes it feels like we're going to run out of fuel. See, all those feelings fit. And yet, you know, God somehow is, thank God, the pilot of this plane. And God knows what God is doing, even though I cannot figure it out. Right? So, when we look at Elizabeth then, okay, we want to reflect. I said earlier, you know what, we don't want to take a trip down memory lane. But we do want to take a trip down memory lane to be grateful, see, for all that God has done for us, in us, through us, and for, in, and through our congregations. God has been generative in us. And we have cooperated with that birthing. We have. Even times when we felt barren and empty, we have been receptive to what God asked of us. So it's important to remember. It's very important to remember. Not so that we stay there, you know, in the past, but that we can bring that past forward and be grateful. And if I know God has been with me in the past, sisters, we can have certainty that God will be with us in the future, no matter what. No matter what, God has been faithful and God will continue to be faithful. Okay? So, no matter what my age, see, what am I being called to birth? Even if I'm past my childbearing years, to use the metaphor. Even if there are no vocations coming after me, do you see? Okay. There is a future. And Elizabeth tells us that there is. Because she tells us what Mary tells us, nothing is impossible for God. Nothing is impossible for God. Okay? And she names her child, you know, all her relatives say, well, what are you going to name him? See, Zachary's, it was the prerogative of the father, of course, to name the child. And she says, no, his name's going to be John. And they say, oh, tisk, tisk. Nobody in the family has that name. I don't know if you had that experience, but I've probably guessed. I'm an ethnic background Italian. And, you know, we have like 5 Julies, you know, and we have, you know, 6 or 7 Angies because somebody was named Angie and everybody gets named. Well, it was the same in this culture, okay? And notice she says, no, his name is John. His name is John. All right, so she comes to her own sense of self. She's able to stand there as a woman and name her own son. So what does she have to offer us as we walk this journey? Okay. Finally, I want to look with you at Anna. The name Anna means graced, favored by God. Favored by God. And it's a feminine derivative of John, Joanna, Johanna. Okay? So there is no coincidence that the last prophet before Jesus is named John, and that the last woman mentioned in the infancy narratives is Anna, whom Luke says was a prophetess. She is the only woman in the entire New Testament called a prophetess. And the name connects her with the Baptist. The name connects her, same root. Graced, favored by God. All right, she is the matriarch. She accompanies us at this time of radical discipleship. At the time when we're discerning how to give our deaths away. How to give our deaths away. And she teaches us that in this time, our best, I'll use this in quotes, our best defense is prayer. Now, when I say that, I do not mean to imply all we can do is pray. I mean, we have all these problems in the congregation, or all these, whatever, decisions to make, and we say, well, all we can do is pray. No, that's not all we can do. All right, we have to think, we have to plan, we have to be wise, we have to work with all those good things, all right? But first and foremost, we have to be women of contemplation. We have to be willing to be women of prayer. Okay? So we need to ask ourselves in terms of the congregation, how are we to pray in the space in which we find ourselves? How are we to discern how to give our deaths away? How are we to decide what our legacy will be? What do we want to leave behind for those that follow us? Okay? What do we want to put into Gina's hands so that she can move forward with confidence and hope? We need to talk about this. But if I cannot admit that we are in the middle space we're in, and that we're trying to hold the breath of the charism until it's raised up to do light, we're not going to be able to have these conversations. And we have to have them. Okay? How are we to give our deaths away? Anna has much to say to us about this. Anna, in this text, Luke tells us, was a widow. Was a widow. Okay. Whatever the word is in Greek for widow means forsaken and left empty. Please take that in. Because sometimes I know I have felt forsaken. I have felt left empty. Right? So in Greek, the word widow means forsaken or left empty. In Hebrew, the word for widow means unable to speak. I hope you can hear the irony, the paradox, in the fact that this widowed woman is the only woman in the entire New Testament called a prophetess. You with me? And in this text, she doesn't say one word. She doesn't say one word. But Luke tells us what? She gave thanks to God, oh, help you, and spoke about the child to all who were awaiting the redemption of Israel. That's what we are to do. We are to speak about the child to all who are awaiting the redemption of Israel. We're to do what she did. All right? Notice how beautiful. All right, some of us are there, right? She's 84. See that? Okay? Some of us are there. Married for 7 years. See? So this empty woman, she had fullness of life. 7, of course, you know, is a number, a mystical number of fullness, right? 7 years married. She had a full marriage. Full marriage. And now she's in the temple till she's 84. 7 times 12. Fullness on top of fullness. Okay? Not forsaken, not left empty, not unable to speak, no matter how she appeared. No matter how she appeared. And I give you this picture by Louis Glinsman. Why? Because these widows were forced to wear black. That's how they were recognized in Jesus' world. Notice that, the glorious outfit on her. Okay, some of us need to flail around with scarves and, you know, whatever. Okay? She's a beauty. She's just a beauty. Okay? She just, more than anything, I guess, where I am in my own life, she just captures things for me. So, in this time then, of walking this moonlit path, in this matriarch time, in this time of radical discipleship, the call is to be prophetic. Prophetic. Now, I'm going to give you this definition of the prophetic from Sandra Schneider's, you know her trilogy, right? Finding the treasure, selling all, buying the field. You know that trilogy she wrote several years ago. The first one was this one, Finding the Treasure. What does she say? I will propose that religious life is a prophetic life form. Okay. Prophetic life form. In the church, whose prophetic character is rooted in and derives from the celibate solitude that unites contemplative immediacy to God and solidarity with the marginalized of society, and expresses itself in the vows that address to the world the challenge of the reign of God. Now, that's a lot to take in. In my own 25-word or less version, What she is saying is, a prophet is one who is centered in God, centered in that celibate solitude, centered in that contemplative immediacy to God. Okay? A prophet is one who is centered in God and who lives on the margins. Centered in God, lives on the margin, in solidarity, notice, with the marginalized. Okay? Again, how can I be centered in God and live on the margins? See? It's paradox after paradox after paradox. To be centered in God and live on the margin is going to require the stretch of love. It's got to. It's got to. Right? And this was true of Anna. She lived in the temple, right, night and day. But she herself was among the most marginalized of her world. The Gospel of Luke is filled with widows. Why? Because Luke's Gospel is the Gospel of the poor and the marginalized. The widows were one of a group in Jesus' world who were most marginalized. Stories like the widow of Nain, stories like the widow with the 2 coins, stories like Anna, they're only in the Gospel of Luke. See? All empty, all forsaken, all unable to speak. And none of them says a word in the Gospel of Luke, but they speak volumes. As I said earlier, sisters, we are at a time of witness. Witness. You know that phrase that says, what you do speak so loudly I can't hear what you're saying. Right? For good or ill. You see what I mean? This is the time, sisters, we are called to oh my, I don't even know what, such such integrity, such authenticity, everything that means that, you know? What people see is better be what they get. Better be what they get. Follow what I'm saying? All right. So again, this Anna, all right? You know, how have you begun? That's a terrible question, isn't it? How have you begun to give your death away? When I go home, I'm going to make the great switch from winter to summer clothing. All right? I'm already, saying, what am I going to get rid of? What haven't I? Even little things like that. It gives you an awareness. It gives you an awareness. None of us are going to be here forever. That's starting to dawn on me. Yes, none of us are going to be here forever. Okay? So there's a line in one of Jessica Powers' poem, The Master Beggar, where she says to Jesus, who's the master beggar, what would you have of me, father and mother, the lover I long to know, the child I would have cherished tenderly, even the blood that through my heart's valves flow? She says, must all my purse be emptied in your hand? The answer to that is yes. I say to myself, Claire, practice now, because eventually it will all be empty. It will all be emptied. Okay? So how I want to make the choice. I want to give it of my own. When I was in leadership, I would say to our sisters who were, reflecting on moving over to our retirement facility, one of whom is a very dear friend of mine, she's in her 90s now, I said to her, Joan, you want to go across the street when you can walk across the street. Our facilities are not when you have to be carried across the street. That's all a metaphor. Do you see what I'm saying? Okay. That little piece on Anna, the other, coming forward at the right time, Luke says. She came forward. She knew God's timing. See why? Because she was a woman of prayer. She was sensitive to the timing of God. God doesn't operate on my time frame. God operates on God's time frame, which is some eternal something, but it's definitely not on mine. When I turn on my computer and it takes 30 seconds for it to boot up and I'm stamping my feet, like, why is it so slow? God's not operating on that, all right? So, we're all, no matter how young or how old, our younger women who make a decision to come to the congregation, they've already considered, what's my life going to be about? What kind of meaning am I going to leave behind? You think they're not asking those questions? Of course they are, right? no matter what age. What do we want to leave behind for the women who follow us? There may be no women who follow me in the Sisters of St. Francis of Philadelphia. We may be at the end. But there are women who are going to follow the radical call to consecrated life. So what do I want to leave for them? Or, or am I going to say, well, I'll be dead and gone, like, who cares? Of course not. That belies your whole life, sisters, to puff it out like that. No, you don't know that. Where am I? So, these are women of hope, these three. These three. They knew how to remain. They knew how to remain. They were all part of the Anoim. You know the biblical Anoim, right? The remnant. Mary came from the Anoim. Elizabeth came from the Anoim. Anna came from the Anoim. They were the remnant. They were the remainers. Okay? That's why they're such good examples for us. Okay? Mary and Elizabeth and Anna. So in this middle space, we best be women who listen, continue to listen about how to get my life together, how to get the congregation's life together, how to serve in the time in which I find myself, okay? How to pray through this time as well. Because they tell us we have to believe it no matter what it looks like. Nothing will be impossible for God. So, Mary Pellegrino. Now what Sister is saying, what?
Right here.
Right here. I taught her Spanish.
She's Mary Pellegrino is a Baden girl.
Yeah.
Ah, fabulous. I picked the right one. All right, she's great. She's great. Her address to LCWR, 2017. Okay. What do I have the name of the talk here? No, I forget the name. But anyway, it was the key. Her address as president, her presidential address, 2017 LCWR. Talks about the diminishment narrative. She says it is a passing story. Okay? We have to look at the diminishment narrative. We have to tell it to ourselves through the lens, through the hearing of faith. Okay? One of the more substantial narratives about religious life that I believe is passing and urgently needs our assistance to continue to pass is what she calls the diminishment narrative. Okay? It's a wonderful talk. You can get all this stuff online. Everybody I'm quoting over here. You can get all this online. If you haven't read Nancy Schreck, please, however long the night, please. Or this Mary Pellegrino, just wonderful, okay? She says a new narrative it needs to be told. And she calls it a narrative of deepening communion. Notice, a new, more complicated and complex narrative about religious life is emerging, and it is a narrative of deepening communion. Such a narrative does not focus narrowly, on human notions of progress and growth, but expands its vision, I would offer faith vision, to embrace God's rhythmic patterns of fruitfulness. God's rhythmic patterns of fruitfulness. Okay? That taking in of the breath, integrating it, giving it out, in blessing, in fruitfulness, for whatever that looks like in terms of my serving. And then I'm going to end with this, since we are in the season of Lent. She says this narrative is a Paschal story. It's a Paschal narrative. It is shaped not by human benchmarks of success and failure, but by the pattern of Jesus' life, emptied and human. And here's the zinger. It is a demanding narrative. And I would offer, it will have a happy ending. This story will have a happy ending. And we need to contribute to writing it.